Computer. Good. Good. So yes, just to warn you, I think I'm sort of legally obliged to tell you that we are recording. So if anybody doesn't quite fancy being immortalised uh, in Technicolor on the web, you might like to switch your camera off, but it's entirely up to you. Good. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Rob Philpott. Some of you will have seen my
Yes.
previous talk about the archaeology of Livonia. Rob's an archaeologist and a research associate at the University of Liverpool. He's undertaken archaeological surveys at various places in the Falklands since 1992. Can't quite do the maths, but I know that's a heck of a long time. And in 2025, he published a report on Port Louis, which, for my money, is one of the most fascinating, probably the most fascinating settlement in the Falklands and the backdrop for so much Falklands history,
No.
much of which I'd say we still feel the consequences of today. So, with that, I'm going to hand over to Rob, and perhaps you'd like to tell us what you are going to be sharing with us before you do share it, Rob.
Well, we're going to be looking at the archaeological survey that we began in 1994 at Port
Boy.
Louis. And
Just 1 second. Can I ask
yes,
everybody to mute their microphones, please, if you're not speaking? Although after Rob's presentation, we'll be happy to have you put your microphones back on. But if everybody could mute for the time being, please. Thank you very much. Back to you, Rob.
okay. So we began to work at, I say we, this is David Barker and I, who have been doing these archaeological surveys, as you say, since 1992. And 1992 was Port Egmont. And then in 1994, at the invitation of John Smith, the sadly deceased former curator of the museum, we began to look at a much bigger site at Port Louis. And our involvement really came through John and through Mike Stammers as well. I should give a mention to him at the Merseyside Maritime Museum, who together they were very instrumental in supporting our work, as was Jane Cameron. And the museum in Liverpool, as well as the Falkland Island Museum, were both very helpful in supporting and financially and in logistically the project that we've been doing. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to look at the types of evidence that we've been using to construct an archaeological survey of Port Louis to try and map what is there on the ground and to try and interpret the remains and try and flesh that out with a historical survey to understand the kinds of activities that were going on this site and to try and identify the structures and earthworks and so on that we could see on the site. So I'll share my screen now, and then we can begin to let's have a look. Right, okay. And then we can begin to look at the evidence and look at the methodology that we've been using. So some of this I have as that. Some of this we looked at a little bit a couple of weeks ago, but just to show the extent of the surveys that we've carried out in the Falklands, which amount to perhaps a dozen sites now, some of them the Falkland Island Company sites, mostly in Livonia, but also two main sites at Port Egmont, Keppel Island in the northwestern offshore islands off West Falkland, and then Port Louis itself in East Falkland. I'm aware there are one or two people listening who don't know the Falklands well, so I'm just being aware of their perhaps lack of the geographical background. So these are the sites and Port Louis we looked at principally between 1994 and 96. And what I want to do is to look at the strands of evidence, first of all, that we've been using as part of the archaeological survey. the aim really has been to create a detailed record of the site. And this consists of a measured survey mapping the extent of the earthworks, the banks and ditches, and the buildings, ruined or standing. And then accompanying that with written descriptions, photographs. Sorry, I think I've jumped. No, that's okay. So looking at the earthworks, looking at the historic maps to contemporary maps, the great thing about a site that was as contentious from the 18th century through to the middle of the 19th century in international affairs is that it resulted in a rich archive of documents and of maps, which mean that we can track through time the development of the settlement. We've been recording the earthworks and we've been recording the standing buildings, as you can see bottom right, which is the main house now at Port Louis. And then we've been looking at the archives, and these are from the Jane Cameron National Archive in Stanley, and the National Archives in Kew, and also in Buenos Aires and in France too. And one of the benefits of the internet and of the digitization of documents is the fact that during the course of the last 10 or 15 years, one benefit of being slow to publish perhaps is that a large amount of new material has been put onto the web, very high resolution web-based resources like these from the Archives Nationales d'Outre-mer in Aix-en-Provence in France, which is a repository of some of the early Bougainville first phase of the French settlement at Port Louis. And you can see there the quality of the map is extraordinary, as is the quality of the digital image that they have put up there. And these are free to use, free to publish, which makes them extraordinarily valuable. So we've been using these new resources, and that includes a large amount of material from the Vernet archive in Buenos Aires as well. So there are new resources that have been very valuable. And also new publications in the last 15 years or so, which have meant that researching the Falklands and researching the individuals from the Dictionary of Falklands Biography, and then that David has edited a superb volume, which is very rich in the detail of the people involved. And then Graham Pascoe's fantastic work on the Falklands saga, I think now 4 volumes, which has produced a lot of new research into the documents, very highly well researched, and a fundamental resource for anybody looking at the Falkland Islands. And that fortunately came out in time for us to use that. And then what we do on the site is mapping the settlement so that when we are confronted with an archaeological site, which in this case is a settlement, it's the former capital of the Falklands, there are dozens and dozens of features, 150 separate archaeological features or buildings, earthworks or buildings, which we've mapped using this. This is now old technology, but it's a total station, which gives you a 3D point, which you can then measure, follow around earthworks and buildings to make a detailed 3D map of the site. And there is David Barker, who is my collaborator on this project. And without David's help, this would not have come to fruition. But the total station enabled us to map the sites, and that results in something that might look like this. This is just a very simple map of all of the features that we've identified. You can see the density of features. Many of these are earthworks, they're banks and ditches. Some of them are buildings, some of them are corrals and batteries and forts and so on. And that is the bald, bare evidence for archaeological features at the site. It's a large site, 1,300 by 1,400 meters, concentrated in some ways, but nevertheless still extending over a large area. That's probably quite a lot of football pitches, which is, I think, the normal way to measure areas these days. But you can see there the density of those earthworks, and you can also see that there are certain concentrations. One here on the headland where the modern main house is, and then another one here by the mole, the pier, and others on the high ground lying behind that. So you can see that already the topography is beginning to influence where these features and buildings are located, and the topography is quite important in that. And there we can see a way of demonstrating what the topography is. This is a contour map from a drone survey, and this shows very clearly where the high ground is, and almost the highest point is where the Spanish fort is. And then you can see there the river or stream valleys that create the headland on which much of the early settlement was based. So those are important topographical indicators and topographical mapping, which enables us to put our features onto the ground. Just to give you an idea of the overall settlement, the settlement at Port Louis was extant as a capital for 80 years, not an enormous length of time, and founded in 1764. But then the British in 1844 moved the capital to Stanley, and that move, from our point of view, archaeologically speaking, was a very valuable and, if unintended, move, because it meant that the settlement, rather than continuing in use, became a farm, and the intensity of use on the farm became far lower. So the preservation of the features at Port Louis has benefited very greatly from the move to Stanley. If you can imagine the middle of Stanley, trying to examine the early features there, that would be a challenge in an intensively occupied site. But you can see there the timeline. And here we have the Port Louis, the French, first of all in the 1760s, followed by the Spanish taking over after only 3 years of occupation. Then Spain abandoning the settlement in 1811 as the political situation deteriorated and Spain lost its colonies in South America. And then in 1820, attempts that became finally successful in 1826 by Louis Vernet, the entrepreneur, Hamburg born, but based then in South America, to settle his short-lived settlement was taken over by the British, repossessing the islands in 1833, and then 11 years of British occupation, which resulted in finally the move to Stanley in 1844. And as I say, that, for our point of view, is very fortunate, preserving many of the remains that otherwise would have been destroyed by continued development. And just as a side, the British settlement in the Falklands began in 1765, so just under a year after the French, at Port Louis, Port Egmont rather, and then the British left in 1774. We almost went to war with Spain in 1770 when the Spanish forced the garrison to leave, and then that was restored in 1771. But I won't be talking about that. But that's something that's going on in the background of the settlement at Port Louis. So where is Port Louis? Well, this is East Falkland, and Port Louis is on the Berkeley Sound, the long, deep sea inlet, on a very well enclosed, very well sheltered harbour, later known as the Careenage in the 19th century, which is a convenient term for it today, even if anachronistically. And you can see there the Careenage is a crucial element in the site location. And the first permanent settlement, I'm sorry, I should also just, for more global, to place the Falkland Islands in their context, because this is rather important for the reasons why almost everybody settled in the Falkland Islands, was its location off the coast of South America, but close to the difficult passage around Cape Horn. And before the canal in Central America, I was going to say the Suez Canal. It's not the Suez Canal, the other one. Panama Canal was built. The only way to get from Europe to the Pacific was around, well, there are two ways, but one of the ways was around Cape Horn. And clearly that, with its very dangerous and difficult sea conditions, meant that having a base on the Falkland Islands, independent of South America and the nations in South America, was an important factor in the value of the Falkland Islands as a colony. So let's look then first at the French settlement, and we're looking then at Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, who was secretary, as you can see, to Louis XV, the mathematician, and the first French navigator of the globe. And Bougainville was a French aristocrat, and after the losses of the 7 Years' War, which concluded in 1763, the French government was unable to invest in researching and settling new lands, and it was down to private individuals to do so. And one of the routes, one of the important factors behind Bougainville's settlement, was colonizing uninhabited lands to replace some of those colonies that had been lost to the French in the war a year or so before. It was a time of an age of discovery and of scientific inquiry too, hence Bougainville's circumnavigation of the globe, but also as an entrepreneur in forming a settlement at the Falklands. And his arguments for the settlement emphasized the advantages of a safe haven and a port of call in the South Atlantic for ships on the way to India, reducing the length of the voyage and avoiding the need to depend on foreign bases en route, particularly important in times of war. And a naval base in the Falklands would control the South Atlantic in the time of war. Bougainville landed at the head of the long sea in Berkeley Sound in February 1764. He surveyed the area and found the oval harbour, the Careenage, and recognised that not only was the harbour enclosed and sheltered, deep enough to take the ships of the day, but there was also fresh water, reserves of peat, which were usable for fuel, and also serviceable building stone. Disappointingly, there were no trees, and we'll see the consequence of that in a moment. The 17th of February, I fixed upon the place of the new colony, which at first was only composed of 27 persons. We set to work immediately to build them huts covered with rushes, to construct a magazine and a little fort, in the middle of which a small obelisk was erected. And there we can see Pernetti, the naturalist, the cleric naturalist who was on the Bougainville expedition, had taken a view of this settlement. And you can see there are two main structures. Here is the apartment house, and here is the French fort with its obelisk. Typically French, one feels, to put an obelisk as an early phase of your your settlement. But then we have this row of apartment buildings, which became the first house, the first houses in the Falklands. And we can see here the location of that building just up the brook here, which later was known as Pigs Brook. But there you have the enclosed harbour, and there you have the headland on which a little bit later the French built the main house for the commandant, and a battery along here, which you can just see along the edge of the cliff. But the house itself, the first building in the Falkland Islands, is shown here on this map of 1766. These maps are superb for understanding the first phase of settlement. And you can see there a little embankment. You can see a little tree nursery down in the base. You can see the fort, which was a crucial element in the defence of the settlement. And then you can see the commandant's house on the headland. And let's look in a little bit more detail at those elements. There is the a detail of those main structures. You can see the fort turns out is a pentagonal fort, as was the classic Vauban style fort in the post-medieval period. And there we have our apartment house. The apartment house is very interesting because this was the original plan for the apartment house, and these plans were drawn on board Bougainville's expedition heading for the Falklands in January 1764. So they were drawn up in ignorance of the conditions on the ground, but these were projected buildings that they intended to build on the site, a two-story building. Notice the richly timbered roof arrangement there, which is one of the main reasons, I think, why these ambitious buildings turned out to be to meet the cold, hard reality of the fact that the Falklands had no trees, and therefore the wood that they had brought, the timber they had brought for construction, was inadequate to the job. But let's look first at the fort then. And you can see here, these are drone photographs, and this is one of the technologies which has really, I think, raised the game in terms of recording this kind of landscape. Bottom left is the best photograph you can get of the French fort standing on the ground, in fact, standing on top of a Land Rover. And you gain no idea there of what this structure looks like, this pentagonal feature. But once you begin to use the drone or use aerial photography, the shape of these structures becomes immediately apparent, and it's very obvious that this D-shaped or pentagonal fort is the original, the first French fort built within a couple of weeks of the first French settlement. You can see as well a later house. One of the confusing things about these earthworks is how they continue to build on top of another. So houses continually rebuilt, remodeled, recycled, and so that you end up very often with a confusing mass of earthworks. But other early French features are constructions. This is the apartment house itself, the one shown in in Pernetti's view. And you can see the bank at the front, which is a deliberate rampart. And then there's a wall along here, which you can see just picked out as an earthwork. And then this is the line of the apartment house itself, with a little wing that comes out here. And there is the drawing, the plan signed by Bougainville of the building that was actually constructed, by contrast with the building that they intended to construct. And you can see this is very much a cut down version of that. And you can see the multiple doors along that facade, which we could see in the Pernetti view. So this is the earliest building, earliest dwelling in the Falkland Islands. And there it is on the ground. And here it is with respect to the main house in the headland, overlooking the brook here. And there is the rampart on which cannons were set as a defensive feature. And then another early French feature is the tanning pits, which are very clear down by the next stream along, or a little bit further to the north. And these tanning pits are very clearly defined, showing again another characteristic of the ground conditions in the Falklands. Very slow growing vegetation, acidic soils. So features that have been cut into the ground, including post holes, pits, tend to survive very well. In this case, 200 years later, 250 years later, you can still see the outline of the tanning pit, which I think is extraordinary. But it does mean that we have high confidence in being able to see features which are depicted on the maps. And then the main house, which was the house of the commandant and of the state, was constructed probably in 1764 or 65, and there it is on the ground. Well, you might say, okay, Philpott, show us where on the ground, but there you can see one of the arms of that, that pentagonal building. This is one of the rooms here, and then there is another room, and this here in the center is the octagonal salon, which was constructed as the centerpiece of the house. And there again, with the eye of, not the eye of faith, but with a careful observation, you can begin to discern the outline of that building. So again, one of the earliest structures in the islands. The French commandant's house, when the Spanish took over in 1767, only 3 years, two or 3 years after this was built, the Spanish took over the same house. And this was planned in 1807 by the Spanish with far more detail. But you can see they've expanded the buildings, they've added rooms on, they've changed the function, they've added a garden with pots and fountains and so on, and divided into little parterres. So we have here a much more Mediterranean style structure by the early 19th century under the Spanish occupation. So the French then constructed a series of buildings, a series of structures. The tannery was an attempt to commercial activity for skins of the loup marin, as they called it. But by 1766, the civilian population, which by that date was about 150 people, was still largely accommodated in tents and cabins, and those are shown on this plan of 1766. But the developments in those early years were ad hoc and uncoordinated. There were no public buildings, there was no church, and the defences were weak and poorly located. There's no sign yet by 1766, 1767 of an urbanized colonial capital. However, it's clear from this plan and another alternative plan that the projection by Bougainville was to create a dual town and fortress. And here we have the town. You can see a central square with radial streets running off that, protected by a wall, and with dwellings here and public buildings around the end of the settlement. And next to it, on the next hill, was a fortress, again a typical Vauban style fortress with bastions, pentagonal in the center, almost like a parody of the French example, which was a very cut down version, which lacked any corner bastions or any overlapping ravelins and so on. So you can see there the intention, the hope perhaps, was that had that remained in French hands, a major settlement, a colonial capital would have been established. However, the French plans were brought to a halt by the objections of the Spanish crown, who put pressure on the French crown to give up their colony. They were very nervous, the Spanish, of accepting a French claim, which would have given a precedent, which would have allowed the British to settle on islands, and also potentially on the Falkland Islands. So it was clear that the Spanish attempt to, or the Spanish successful attempt to eject the French was a crucial part of their defense of the South American mainland, and an attempt to push the British out of South America, and clearly or out of the South Atlantic. And clearly, when the British settled created a garrison on Port Egmont, and the Spanish objected to that, almost going to war. That was again part of the tension, the international tension, and the international rivalry for control of bases in the South Atlantic. So the Spanish set about adapting and changing the settlement of Port Louis. And one of the first things they did was to construct a far better located fort, Fuerte de la Bandera, fort of the ensign, fort of the flag, which is the main fort on the top of the hill, which was far better sited than the French fort, which inexplicably was below a slight ridge, so had no clear view of the of Berkeley Sound, which seems an odd omission. But then also the Spanish began to construct, and they're not shown yet in 1774, but began to construct batteries that protected the entrance to the careenage, to the harbour. We'll look at those in a moment. But you can start to see that even by 1774, the Spanish have constructed, well, by 10 years later, there are records of about 30 buildings on this at this settlement. And you can see that they are beginning also to create a defensible site. And the military character of Puerto Soledad, as they called it, was clear from the complement of the establishment. It had infantry, a naval contingent, and artillery, and all of the services that those military required. So there are storehouses, there are workshops, and a guard of the workshops, so that you end up with a large complement, which ended up with a complement of about 200 in the early years of the Spanish settlement. But let's have a look at some of these plans that have come to light. This one again has relatively recently come to light, 1785. And the beauty of these is that we have one of 1774, which we can compare with 10, 11 years later. And then we have other plans, or views in this case, but another plan that goes along with this, another 10 years, 9 years later. So we have an excellent sequence of plans and views. This is particularly valuable because it shows the buildings in elevation. You can see what the buildings look like. You can see that they're invariably one story, apart from this building here, which is in oven. And you can see the configurations of windows and doors. That's a bit of a specialist interest, I must admit. And then you can see the storehouses down by the entrance to the harbour, where the vessels would anchor and load and unload stores into those warehouses. So the maps and the plans are extremely valuable for understanding the Spanish settlement. What's clear, though, is that there is some confusion, there's some contradiction between them. This one here, 1785, has very obvious discrepancies from the earlier and later plans. So it becomes a bit of guesswork to try and work out which was the actual function of some of the buildings, and only excavation, I suspect, would determine that. But you can see already that there are zones within this Spanish settlement, and you can see that on the main headland, where the main house is today, this is the main house, the Spanish house that we've just seen in plan, and then Presidio and Cuartel, which is the barracks and the penitentiary became a convict settlement. And then you can see down here in this valley elements like the hospital, a series of workshops and a series of naval and military barracks here, and then a forge down here, and then the warehouses. So the settlement here under the Spanish is zoned. But what's very interesting is when you compare this settlement with those of the Patagonian coast from the 1780s, which are on the attenuated supply route from Montevideo and Buenos Aires. They're a long way from their home base. Those settlements themselves are still conform to the Spanish colonial layout, with a central square with buildings on all four sides, which matches the Spanish layout for both military and also for civilian settlements. Here at Port Louis, Puerto Soledad, this has broken down completely, and this is at the end of a very long, very attenuated supply route, and it's clear that the control over the settlement had diminished, partly perhaps because of the topography, and partly also because of the climate and the difficulty of creating the sort of settlement that would have been a standard practice on the mainland. So there is the view of 1794 during the Malaspina expedition. Alejandro Malaspina, another scientific expedition, called in at Port Louis twice. But there we have this valuable record of the settlement towards the end of its life. And there we have the key Spanish buildings highlighted on the survey plan. Not every Spanish building is on there, but those are the main ones that survive in a good state of preservation. And you can start to see now, there is the fort, very recognizable, very characteristic, with its pentagonal form. And then these little clusters of structures clustered by function, by zone. And then you can see now the battery here and here, which are protecting the harbour entrance with a covered way that ran along from a guard post at the base of the entrance. And you'll see that in a moment. There we can see the fort. And this is another very good example of how the drone has revolutionized our understanding of the detail of these earthworks. This is the best we can get from a ground level view. We can plot it out and make a contour plan of it. But now from the air, from the drone, you can start to see all kinds of details. There are, in fact, not clearly visible on this, but there are 5 gun platforms along here. This is a rampart, and this is where the cannons or guns were set on either side, and these were separated by low ridges, which are visible on the ground. But you can also start to see all kinds of other features. There's a little uh, pair of enclosures, post-built enclosures, which are probably later in date. This is almost certainly the powder magazine, a judicious use of space to separate the magazine from the fort itself. But that is not terribly obvious on the ground. In fact, we missed that completely, and it was only through the drone survey that we managed to see that there was a building there. And again, another building here, which is very far from obvious on the ground. So the Spanish fort on top of the hill, you can see its higher location over the harbour. And then again, the Spanish battery that overlooks the entrance. This is very interesting because it underwent some modification. The battery itself is this outer structure, but it's been modified with an internal wall and a bank against the entrance. And then when we look at the map sequence, we can see that Vernet constructed a corral out of the battery. So he would have set up this bank against which cattle could be driven into the corral, into the internal space. And then in the final stage, and under the British occupation, this became a garden. So it was a valuable earthwork that performed several functions. The effort that had been invested in creating that was not lost on subsequent occupants. And so each of them took advantage of this big earthwork, protection for cattle, protection against the wind for a garden. And there again, the dismal ground level view, which shows very little evidence of the complexity of this earthwork as opposed to the drone view. And there is our covered way. There's a little guard post just set on the ground. The Spanish guard would have crossed the mouth of the harbour by boat and then were protected as they ran along to man the battery here, which again looks out onto Berkeley Sound, protecting the Spanish settlement. Who are they protecting it from? It's always the British. And the Spanish invested a lot of time and energy in ensuring that the British didn't gain a foothold on the Falklands again after they left in 1774. This is a detailed plan of one of those clusters of buildings. And there we can see, well, it's confused because what we can see is some British buildings of the 1830s and 40s. Corral here is a British construction, but most of these buildings are Spanish. And there we have the original Spanish fort, church rather, the first church in the Falkland Islands, built in 1767 or 8, I can't remember, one or the other. And then the replacement built in the early 19th century. And those are both planned in great detail. But these buildings are barracks, they're structures like warehouses. There's this one here is a forge and smithy. And then one of these, this one here, is a British building set on top of this cluster. This is the storehouse guard, the house of the storehouse guard. But you can see again on the ground that these earthworks are very clearly visible, even if it's hard to work out what they mean. But as soon as you get in the drone, use the drone, you can start to see the structure of these buildings set along this track, which has remained in use from the Spanish period. And you can see that the buildings and the constructions are all set, most of them are set within a banked enclosure for shelter and for drainage. But you can also see, I mean, I think remarkably, you can see here along this line of this wall, a series of post holes where these are posts from a building that was constructed in the 1770s. And those are still evident, as are the posts set in the top of this bank here. So the survival is remarkable, but it does create confusion of earthworks. And there we have one of the later Spanish church. We're very fortunate in having this kind of detail because it does show the construction technique. It shows the size and the function of the rooms. So we can work out very clearly from the plans and from the earthworks on the ground what the structures were in their functional life. And there again, the drone under ideal conditions with a low raking light, which picks out those earthworks. This is the house of the storehouse guard. This is a remarkable survival. You can see the bank around it, which is intended to serve as a windbreak, but also then serves here as a drain to take away the surface water. But this is the house itself, and you can see the remains of what must be, I think, a turf-built construction, this is the wall of that house. And one of the things we're going to do, thanks to the generous grant from the Shackleton Scholarship Fund, is to do some test pitting on some of these sites. We were going to be doing that in February, but we've had to put that back to November or December. So we will be able to determine the construction technique of some of these structures and gain more evidence of the dating and the function of them as well. In 1811, the Spanish abandoned the settlement under the pressure of the revolution in South America. And some years later, the United Provinces of the River Plate became independent from Spain in 1816. And for 9 years, the settlement, well, probably in fact a little bit longer than that, effectively the settlement remained abandoned. But the Uranie expedition, French expedition, which was shipwrecked in Berkeley Sound at Uranie Bay in 1820, fortunately for us and very unfortunately for them, meant that they had time on their hands, and Duperrey, the surveyor, spent time very usefully for us again, mapping the remains of the ruin, the Port Saint Louis, the remains of the town of St. Louis or Port Louis, this is the highest quality cartographical survey, which means we can identify the structures on the ground, even though they are ruined. What he shows beautifully here is this T-shaped building, which locates the only plan that shows the second Spanish church, shows exactly where it is, alongside that little cluster of buildings. It shows the main house, which was also drawn rather by Arago. And this shows very clearly the chimneys of that octagonal centered room with its square cruciform layout. And there we can see a building which was the Presidio and Cuartel, which is the barracks, and the Presidio, the penitentiary. That is interesting because this structure here was shortly to be pressed into service by the next contender to take over and occupy the islands. And that was Louis Vernet, the entrepreneur, born in Hamburg, multilingual, highly cultured man, a merchant. And Vernet began to look at the possibility of ranching in the Falkland Islands. And in 1826, after a couple of attempts to settle the islands, these culminated in Vernet establishing a colony in 1826 with over 90 settlers of various nationalities: English, German, Spanish, French, South American. And his settlement was to a degree successful. He had a fish salting establishment, which we'll look at in a second, but he also mapped the settlement. What is interesting about this map is he leaves off the buildings that are not stone built, so the turf built, which he recognised were temporary and ephemeral, are not shown, and only the stone built structures are depicted on this plan. And it shows the settlement around 1830. And there you can see that H-shaped plan, which is Presidio and Quartel pressed into service as his house. So almost everything that Vernet is mapping here was a building constructed on an earlier building, a Spanish building in almost all cases. I think in one case, potentially a French building. But it's clear that, one might expect, having constructed a building which didn't then last very long, fell into disrepair, the stone work, the cut stone or the broken stone, is usable as a resource to recycle for your own house. So the recycling of building sites and building stone is very common at Port Louis. We can see it carries on into the British period too. But I mentioned that Louis Vernet was established a fish salting establishment. That was at Fish Creek, a little bit to the north of Port Louis, only a couple of miles away, but on a promontory. And there you can see again very clearly with the drone an earthwork which cuts off the promontory. But you can see a series of structures here which must consist of a fish salting, a fish drying shed, and various other houses for the fish salters themselves. And this remained in use for several years. 1 year, Vernet is said to have shipped 80 tons of mullet, dried salted mullet, to the mainland. So the fish were very easy to catch and very prolific. So it was fish salting was an easy occupation for a commercial enterprise. But we mentioned Vernet's house, and here are the remains of Vernet's house, one of the best preserved ruins at Port Louis. And this is basically the Spanish buildings that have been converted by Vernet into his house. We can see on the ground here, you can see the remains of some of the cross walls, just poking through what was a horse corral in the 90s when this was drawn. This was surveyed rather. And there is Vernet drawing his house when he was attempting to get compensation some years later from the British government. But you can see the detail we have of Vernet's house. And there we have the survey plan. These are the remains of the house as ruins, as foundations, visible as a parch mark in the corral, and then visible here as earthworks. One of the fascinating things about looking at this type of archaeology, this historical archaeology, is the way in which we can stitch together the maps, the documents, and the archaeological remains. And here we have a wonderful description, probably by George Whittington, of Vernet's house in 1831 when he visited on board a British vessel. And I'll read it very quickly because it gives such a rich, detailed account. Having landed, I immediately paid a visit to the governor, Don Vernet, who received me with much cordiality. His features are prepossessing and his address gentlemanly and pleasing. He possesses much information and speaks fluently several languages. The house is long and low, of 1 story, and has very thick walls of stone, as we could see. In the sitting room, I found a good library of Spanish, German, and English works. A lively conversation passed at dinner party consisting of Vernet and his lady, Captain Langdon and his family, a Captain Brisbane, and 2 American gentlemen belonging to a sailing schooner detained at the island by Don Vernet. In the evening, we had music and dancing. In the room was one of Stoddart's pianofortes, and Donna Verney, a Spanish lady, favoured us with some excellent singing. It sounded not a little strange to listen to Di Tanti Palpiti, well executed at the Falkland Islands, where we had expected to find a few fishermen. This is a wonderful description of the interior of something archaeologically we can't get at. We can see the building, we can see its thick walls, and we can guess that it's single story, but this is fleshing out the activities and the richness of the detail of the lives of the people who were there. So I think that is one of the most interesting descriptions we have of the Falklands and of Port Louis at that time. And there we can see, again, more drone pictures, but you can start to see the walls of this structure. You can see in the base of the corral some of the walls. So this is Verney's house, converted from a Spanish building, and then in turn adopted by the next administration to take over the islands. And that was the British in 1833. In 1833, the British government had decided to act decisively to regain the islands, which they had left in 1774. They'd never accepted the legitimacy of Verney's authority, and in 1829 had protested to the Buenos Aires government. But somewhat unceremoniously, on the 1st of January 1833, the Clio, with Captain Onslow on board, served notice to the naval commander in charge that he intended to exercise the right of sovereignty over these islands. And from 1833 onwards, Port Louis and the Falklands as a whole have been continuously occupied by the British. And one of those, that early year of when the authority had not been established fully over the islands, the Clio left very shortly after it had arrived, leaving in charge Matthew Brisbane, who had been Verney's agent, and he was employed to oversee the settlement on behalf of the British. But in 1833, the Port Louis murders took place, where the gauchos, who'd been employees of Verney, murdered 5 of the settlers. The gauchos were notoriously unruly, and this group of gauchos included 5 convicts, so I suppose they were not drawn from the highest echelons of society. But one of the buildings we're going to see down here, one of the casualties was William Dixon, whose store is shown a little bit later on in 1842, shown down here, and we'll see that from the air. But this was the scene for that gruesome series of murders, which took place on this as really as the stage for that that event. Another visitor in 1833 was the Beagle, the vessel the Beagle under Fitzroy, who called in twice over a space of a year. And on board there was Charles Darwin, the naturalist. And Darwin, his impression of the place was not very favourable. It was no more than a collection of half a dozen houses pitched at random. And he observed that in the time of the Spaniards, when it was a botany bay for Buenos Aires, in other words, a convict settlement, it was in a much more flourishing condition. The inhabitants are a curious mixed race. Their habitations are in a miserable condition and deficient in almost every accommodation. The place bespeaks what it has been, a bone of contention between nations. He cheered up, though, when he found some fossils in the sandstone beds, the Fox Bay Formation around the settlement. That must have done no end of good for his spirits. But little was done with the British settlement for 8 years until the British decided to establish the colony more securely. And by 1840, the Colonial Land and Immigration Commissioners in London were actively considering taking over and colonizing the islands, and how they could, and considering too how they could achieve that. They circulated a report which identified 4 grounds for colonizing the islands: a port for refreshment and refitting of merchant vessels sailing round the Horn, the usefulness of a British port between the Atlantic and Pacific, which would be valuable for a naval force, as a penal colony, and also as an agricultural and commercial colony. And accordingly, they sent Lieutenant Governor Richard Moody, who arrived in 1842 and immediately set about securing the settlement as a more viable colony. And he began to create a series of buildings on the site, which included his own house here, Government House, significantly once again on the remains of Vernet's house, so recycling that building yet again, and also allowing the settlers to construct a series of buildings. Preston Villa here, which we'll see in a moment, a hut belonging to Penny, Perry's house. These are all settlers, but you can see a complete lack of order. They're haphazard, they're random, each of them set on the site of some earlier Vernet or Spanish building. So there is no order, there's no coherence to this settlement. But just as in 1843, well, in the 1840s, early 1840s, the Colonial Office began to conceive of a more appropriate type of capital for the Falkland Islands, and they drew up an initial plan which showed a settlement, a town surrounded by plots, suburban plots, and then surrounded by larger blocks of land for pastoral farming further away. And it became the centre, potentially, of a colonial town, which would have been an enormously different scenario from what we can see here, mapped by Robinson in 1842. Just to see one or two of the buildings we can see there, the settlement mapped, drawn by someone from the Fitzroy expedition. And there again in 1842, the settlement, haphazard, poorly maintained as well. And there you can see the location of the Government House, as it was somewhat grandly called. And Moody makes the interesting observation that he had a prefabricated house made by Manning and Co. of Stepney. Well, we can see what the Manning houses look like, and they were cottages which had been built largely for the Australian gold rush and then the Californian gold rush. And we can see exactly how these structures, which were very highly praised at the time, because they were portable, they didn't need any specialist equipment or knowledge to fit them together. So we can presume that Moody was living in something that looked very similar to that. This is 1842, so it's round about the same period, but I think it doesn't include the Manning house. But there you can see these long wings of Moody's house in 1842, which I think will include the Manning house. So that gives us an indication of the kind of building in which Moody was living, but it also shows the pragmatism of prefabrication of buildings to these treeless islands. So bring your own timber, make sure it's fitted together. And in fact, one of the other settlers here, J.B. Whittington, also seems to have brought a prefabricated house. They were modular, so you could extend them, because this is his house and this is his extensive garden out at the front of the house. And other settlers, Preston Villa, built by Charles Melville, who was a sea captain, a 3-roomed structure there, close to the French fort just behind. And then other features that were constructed under the British, under Moody, Moody and his antecedents, were the Penannular Corral here. And again, the detail from the drone shows us all kinds of subtle features there. You can see there's an enclosure behind, which probably would have been a post-built enclosure for livestock. And there you can see a small horse corral attached to the main corral. And here is the bank against which the livestock were driven. I believe it's called the Mangera, but I'm not sure that I'll be corrected on that, I think, by somebody in about 3 minutes' time. And then again, we can see other elements of the British settlement. And here too, the Spanish had built, this is a Spanish warehouse. This is Dixon's store, the man who was brutally murdered in the Port Louis murders. And you can see around his warehouse, there is an enclosure, presumably a garden of some sort. And then on the cliff edge, now falling into the sea, is a little forge with, you can see very clearly the floor surface inside that in the edge of the cliff. So you can see there again the way in which these buildings were used and reused, recycled. But here, this is a stone construction and would have been a fairly substantial building. And there it is. I believe it's one of those, I think, on the shore. This is Whittington's house, a 2-story building. And this is the plan that we ended up with, which is putting all those phases together. A few of those constructions, we couldn't work out the date of them. They're not shown on any of the maps. But you can see there the density and the complexity of the phase plan with the various phases, the French in red, the Spanish in ochre, yellow, in blue, cyan, the Vernay period, and then the British in darker blue. And you can see the way in which the same areas, the same locations are used repeatedly, recycling and reusing both the sites as well as the stone from those buildings. A couple of other events during the British occupation were the British use of this site as a capital was the visit of James Clark Ross in 1842, the British Antarctic expedition, which overwintered for 5 months, I think much to Moody's horror. I don't think they got on, James Clark Ross and Moody. The Erebus and Terror, which are now much more famous as a result of both vessels having been found. And there is the magnetic observing station, the lid for a stone, which has a hole in it, which is the actual point from which the observations were taken. And then a tidal gauge along the shore, again with a plate, a copper alloy plate, 1842, marking as a benchmark for the tidal measurements. But this expedition resulted in a series of buildings being constructed for the officers and for the men, the crew of the vessels. And I think as an attempt, a job creation exercise, the crew also walled in the graveyard, and the larger graveyard, there is within that, it's not very clear, but within that is a smaller graveyard with at least 35 burials in here. But they were put to work to build a high wall around the graveyard to keep them busy while they were making observations. And then in 1843, Moody began to invest in Port Louis and constructed a series of cottages for the gauchos on the site of a Spanish hospital, again using the stonework from the Spanish hospital, and also a navy pier. And there is David. It looks like it's raining, doesn't it? It wasn't always beautiful weather, but these were new constructions after 1842. And unfortunately, just as Moody began to invest in settlement and had drawn up a complete plan, a complete layout of a new town to be called Anson at Port Louis, just as he had invested the time and energy in creating a more permanent settlement, the government in London decided, sorry, I'll just move on, decided to move the capital from here, from Port Louis to Port William, to the current location in Stanley. And so J.B. Whittington, who wasn't known for his subtlety, described the new town location as the most miserable bog hole. Stanley was a great site for, it had a better, for maritime purposes, it had a better deep water harbour. But as a land-based site, which is clearly where people live, it was far wetter, more harder work, very boggy ground, and on the hard, dry camp of Port Louis, by contrast, this would have made an ideal settlement. And here is the laid out settlement according to the principles of 19th century colonial design: wide streets on a gridiron pattern with regular plots, generous sized plots, actually, some of the largest in the colonial era of the 19th century. You can see that there's an attempt to respect the topography, although not wholly satisfactorily. Public squares, again, a main feature of colonial towns of the 19th century, and then space reserved for a church and for other public buildings, and the parsonage and the observatory that they clearly intended to continue in use. And one interesting feature of this map is that it contains all of the earlier features, all the early buildings: Penny's Hut, Perry's Hut, Philomel Cottage here, which was Preston Villas. These are all, this is Whittington's house, these are all incorporated into that layout, slightly uncomfortably in some ways. But nonetheless, this grandiose scheme, which was to be called Anson, was scuppered by the government deciding to move the settlement in 1844. A lot of the principles that were applied to the plan of Anson were also applied to Stanley, the way in which the plots were laid out, the broad streets, the regular gridiron pattern, the public squares, and so on. But the miserable bog hole won out in terms of the final settlement. We've seen Darwin. We've heard his discovery of the fossils, which were of great interest. And we've heard his views, which were not very positive about the Falklands. But when I was looking through in the National Archives quite a few years ago now, looking through the letters in to the government, to the Colonial Office, I turned over very quickly the scruffy little note, and then I noticed on the end of it the words Charles Darwin, and that made my eyes light up, because it's a letter to the Colonial Office from Darwin replying to Charles Wood. We don't know, we haven't got Wood's letter, but it's quite clear that Darwin was responding to a request for information. And it seems that because Darwin had been to the Falklands, they were soliciting information on anybody from anybody who might have a view on the question at hand, which seems to have been some question about the ease of passage between Port Louis and Port Stanley or Stanley. And it seems that I wonder whether the background to that was the government was being charged for a lot of haulage or transfer of goods and possessions from Port Louis to the new town, which began in 1844 as a town. And I wonder whether they felt that was an unreasonable level of cost that was being incurred, but it's difficult to be sure. And then finally, to look at the material culture, because one of the things we haven't been doing yet is any excavation. We are planning to do that later this year. But in 2023, while the weather was inclement when we were trying to fly the drone, we looked at a couple of areas of sheep eroded land on the ground, and it became clear that there were large amounts of ceramics and other material in the soil, as well as on the beach, where many years ago we had seen large quantities of rubbish, which is another term for material culture that archaeologists love, but dumped on the beach, and therefore giving us an indication of the material that was in use on the settlement, where it was coming from, the dating of the structures that were underneath this eroded patch. And there you can see the majority of what we found was British, this bamboo pattern from the 1890s, Stoke-on-Trent manufacturer. But these are Spanish in origin. These three from Seville in mainland Spain, late 18th century, early 19th century, exactly the period you'd expect for the Spanish occupation of the site. And then one solitary piece of French ware from Marseille. So this is the only material evidence we have for that French period from the site. And we're looking here at much of this was from an area which had been a forge, and lo and behold, there is a grindstone from the forge, which is one of the classic pieces of equipment that a forge and blacksmith shop would have had for sharpening iron tools and weapons. Another surprise was the quality of preservation of leatherwork. These are relatively late 19th century shoes and a lappet from a shoe. Also 19th century bottles. These were found in Pigsbrook when Peter Gilding was cutting the channel to improve the drainage. But it demonstrates something that David, I think, might be talking about if I think Graham is interested in a talk that David's offered on the ceramics, because what you can tease out here are things like the way in which this pattern, the bamboo pattern in the 1890s, occurs at site after site in the Falklands. And it was quite clear that the Falkland Island Company was importing this particular pattern in large numbers to the islands, shedding interesting light on the consumer and also the importer's pattern, the merchant's pattern, patterns of trade. So there are lots of interesting questions that material culture can begin to answer. And then finally, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about Lafonia, but the power of place, because I think this is a wonderful quotation which illustrates for me the value of the site itself. And it's written by Carl Skottsberg, a Swedish naturalist. Port Louis is the classical ground of the Falklands. Here lie the ruins of the old settlement. Here Charles Darwin strolled about. Here J.D. Hooker, the naturalist, collected materials for his famous Flora Antarctica. Here the Challenger was anchored. All these memories crowd upon the mind of a naturalist of today and cast a halo around the brown, desolate heath. And that, to me, captures the value of place, of the significance of a place like Port Louis, which is far more than simply the earthwork remains, but it's something that goes well beyond the physical remains into the rich tapestry, I suppose, of the documents and the lives that we know were lived here in Port Louis. The FIMA Friends and Pete Gilding very generously supported the financially the delivery of this monograph, which came out last year, which is from which these are the edited highlights. You've seen the goals and the really dirty fouls in this talk, but this gives you the whole story. It's available from Archaeo Press in Bicester in Oxfordshire. And there are many acknowledgements in there, you can read them, but the Shackleton Scholarship Fund, Falkland Island Museum and National Trust. And then Pete Gilding, the FIMA Friends, Jim McAdam, and then people who helped us on the ground, Mike and Sue Morrison, Jane Cameron, John Smith, Nigel Shorrock, and then Peter Gilding as well. And last but by no means least, David Barker, without whom this would never have come out. So thank you to all of those. And thank you to you for sticking with it. And if there are any questions, I'll do my best.
Rob, thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure, am I coming up here? Or anybody? Am I being heard? Is my voice on?
Yes, you are.
Good, good. Rob, thank you so much. That was without doubt fascinating, and I'm sure everybody feels the same way. There were so many questions that came up in my mind that you know follow on from what you were saying. But I'll first of all open it up to the audience, and if anybody would like to put a question to Rob, can you perhaps raise a hand? I think there's a digital way of doing that, but you can also literally just wave your hand, and I'll try and track you down and highlight you. Just please switch your mics on if you would. Down bottom left-hand corner, you'll see an audio switch, and you can demute yourself or put your mic on so we can hear you. So this is the time to put your mics back on, please. And you can just shout now if you want. Otherwise, I will ask a question. I'll give it a couple of seconds to see whether anybody else is going. David Tatham, it's rather good to see you made it.
Yes, I did eventually. Thank you, Greg.
Good. I'm delighted. I'm delighted. Just going back to the earliest phase, Rob, when the French arrived, how did they survive? Because I ask because when I was in southern Chile, in Punta Arenas, and going out to an area called Fuerte Bulnes, and that whole area, the earliest Chilean settlement, I think, literally starved.
Yeah.
And yet the topography, the wildlife, the resources, the foodstuffs, and so on would not have been terribly different for the French in those days. Actually, earlier than that case of starvation at the Chilean settlement. How close were they to actual starvation? It must have been tough.
Well, I think it was difficult. I mean, there's no mention of that. I mean, they were supplied by the French, by Bougainville's expedition. There was a lot of material, a lot of food stuff were brought in, but they had some resources. They had fish, they had birds, the geese, for instance.
Yeah.
There was not. I mean, one of the things they tried to do immediately was to set up nurseries, not only for trees, but also to begin to grow food, to make themselves self-sufficient. But obviously that takes a little while to get established, and you first of all have to surround your gardens by embankments and so on. So there's a fair bit of work to do. But it's not been something I've noticed in the original documentation, actually, for the French. That's a very interesting question.
But perhaps it speaks to the Bougainville's ability to resupply the colony, whereas the Chileans over on the other
Yeah.
side in a similar latitude with similar topography and everything were just simply not much good at it.
Well, I think that was certainly true of the Spanish, actually, because the Spanish in towards the end of the end of their occupation in the early 19th century had reduced the livestock. You know, there were wild animals. I should say, yes, the French had brought wild brought livestock from Montevideo and St. Catherine's Island in off Brazil. So they had brought some livestock of their own, which I think seemed to have taken off fairly quickly. But the Spanish themselves, they were criticized later for not gardening. For they only had 2 gardens. The French in their first 3 years had no fewer than 4. And so the Spanish don't seem to have been very proactive in growing their own food, and they don't seem to have been proactive in getting their own fuel either. It's interesting they were complaining about the lack of fuel, and they slaughtered most of the cattle. By about 1806, they were down from 5,000 down to 240 cattle of the live cattle that had survived from and proliferated from Bougainville's era. And the supplies from Montevideo were very intermittent. I think they were struggling. There was a shortage of vessels. Sometimes the supply vessels didn't arrive. The settlement, the occupants were suffering from scurvy, alcoholism, and depression, I suspect, as well.
Yeah.
So it becomes, the Spanish were much less well equipped. I wonder whether they were relying on these supply routes from what was for them fairly close by. But clearly, the French and the British afterwards were considerably more skilled in the art of gardening for a start, and the art of sustaining themselves on these islands. But it's a very interesting question, Graham. Yeah.
And I'll just ask one more, and then I promise I won't. I'll pass it on to Neville Clifton, who I see has raised a hand. And that just struck me as you were talking about the Port Louis murders that followed on immediately from the British arriving in 1833 to reassert sovereignty and throwing the provinces, the Rio de la Plata people out. It looks like a fairly classic example of somebody or a nation coming in, pretty much destroying the organization that was there, leave nothing in place, and chaos ensued, which we've seen in a much larger scale elsewhere, but
Yes,
macro.
create a vacuum, and then and then those who are there. It's unfortunate that it's the most violent and the least.
Mm.
Uh, I suppose what's the word? I mean, Charles Darwin talks about the gauchos, and he and Fitzroy himself as well in 1833 are both fearful of the results of leaving. Once they went, they felt that the situation was very dangerous. The gauchos were gambling, they were playing with knives, they were violent, they were fighting, and so clearly there was a potential for what then went on, what actually happened, which is that those settlers who were trying to establish some level of ordered society were the ones who suffered from the violence of the gauchos. I mean, I suppose bringing in 5 convicts probably wasn't a good career move, really, in terms of
Bad management, anyway.
ability.
Yeah. Neville Clifton, switch your mic on, Neville, if you would, so that you can ask a question, please. Neville, I know you want to ask a question because you've got your hand raised, but we'll move on.
Sorry. Hi, Rob. Just a quick question. Appreciate the presentations, very good, very detailed, and there's a lot of work to be done that I can see. You briefly showed a clip of Peter's house, the barracks building there where Peter currently resides. The history around that building is a little bit unclear. You often see it in some Argentine literature as the original governor's house and all that sort of thing. What's your findings on that? I understand it was built by the British.
It was in 1843. I was going to mention that actually, but having gone way over time, I felt I couldn't. It was the new barracks built in the 1842 plan shows that there's nothing on the site. In 1843, it's shown on the plan. So, and it's absolutely clear that this is a house, as a barracks built in 1843 by the British. There's no question that's Vernet's house at all. And we can see where Vernet's house was. I mean, it's absolutely unequivocal. So, yeah, so that was a myth I was going to lay to rest if I hadn't burbled on for so long. Anyway, but I think what I wonder, I think that might deserve a small note in the Falkland Island Journal, just to emphasise that it is in the book, but perhaps it needs drawing out as a topic, just to lay that one to rest. There is no doubt that that's the new barracks built by the British.
Yeah, so, I appreciate that.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
And you're absolutely spot on. Yes.
Good.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Questions from anybody else?
Can I just say, I think it was Colin who mentioned lazy beds last time. And I've been looking at the lazy beds in Scotland and also looking at lazy beds in the Falklands. And that's a very interesting observation. So thank you very much for that, because that's set me down another little hair running.
What are lazy beds, Rob?
They are, it's a form of cultivation where largely in upland settings, where a trench is dug and the sod is turned over from two sides onto a raised strip in the middle. And often that raised strip is fertilized first usually with seaweed. If you read the account of the gardening at Port Egmont, it looks very much like lazy bed cultivation there. And this was an upland, it's Irish. We find it in Scotland quite regularly, and you find it in areas of northern England as well. And it was Colin who mentioned that. And you end up with ridges, cultivation ridges, which are very distinctive. So the hollow drains the site, and the ridge is where you grow your potatoes or whatever you want to grow. So as I say, I'm very grateful. I think it was you, Colin, wasn't it? I think who mentioned that. So thank you for that.
I would add that the name lazy beds is a misnomer, because the amount of work that would be done to create these things.
Yes, anything but lazy. Yes, I think that's right. And there's a suggestion that it's the ground that was lazy. This was a way of bringing into cultivation ground that wasn't otherwise cultivated. So it was lazy in that respect.
That's a good thought there. Apropos of your use of the word Mangaira, the point into Stanley Harbour is Mangaira Point.
Yes.
And as soon as I saw this huge earthwork, I thought I would have thought of that as a Mangaira. So I think it's a most appropriate word.
Right. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I think it was Mike Morrison who put me on to the name for that, but I wasn't sure that was in how widespread that was. I think it's a Spanish term, and it seems to correspond. It's a pipe or something, or a bank or something like that. So it seems appropriate. So thank you again. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I've always feel slightly nervous talking about things like that to people who know the situation on the ground far better than I do, but at least I suppose archaeologically I may have a small contribution to make.
Good. Finally, any other questions from anybody? Great. Well, Rob mentioned earlier on his colleague David Barker, who's an expert on ceramics. And I think we just got a clue there from what Rob was saying, that ceramics can probably not only illustrate a story, but provide some very interesting information about what happened in history. So at some point, whether it will be this season or in our next season of talks, I hope David Barker is going to give us a talk about his work on ceramics remains. I suppose mainly shards. I wouldn't think too many dinner services survived from the 18th century, but what all that kind of work tells us. So that's something to look forward to. So yes, I'd just like now to thank Rob Philpott, and if you all care to unmute, you can join me in applauding his excellent talk. Rob, thank you not just for this one, but also for your previous talk about the archaeology of Livonia, which all of which has been fascinating. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for listening. And I'm sorry I've gone on so long.
Thank you.
We might have complained had it not all been absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
Good.
I could have been talking to myself by the end.
All right. Well,
thanks very much, Graham. Thank you for inviting
thank
me.
you to the audience. I think in one or two cases, 2-3 people are sharing the same camera. So we have an audience, I think, of about 25, 26 people. That's very pleasing indeed. Thank you all, folks, so much. And I'm going to count down now to switching us all off and letting everybody get away to whatever you're going to spend the rest of the evening on. So from me, good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks,
Yeah.
Rob. Very
Good
interesting.
night.
All the best.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, out.